Part 1: The Discovery. There is an object in a museum in Athens. It sits in a glass case in the National Archaeological Museum, in a room devoted to one of the most extraordinary shipwrecks ever found. The object itself is not beautiful, not anymore. It is a collection of fragments, dark and encrusted, roughly the size of a show box when reassembled, made of a bronze that has spent 2,000 years at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. It is corroded, incomplete, and in places fused into masses that took a century of careful work to separate. But inside it, inside this ruined, ocean-darkened lump of ancient metal, there are gears. Dozens of them. Interlocking, precisely cut, arranged in a system of extraordinary mechanical complexity. Gears that mesh with other gears, that drive pointers across dials, that track the movements of the sun and the moon and the planets across the sky with an accuracy that would not be matched by any known mechanism for another 1,000 years. The Antikythera Mechanism, as it has come to be called, is the most sophisticated scientific instrument to survive from the ancient world. It is, by any reasonable definition, a computer, an analog computer, built by hand, 2,000 years before the concept of computing existed. It calculated. It predicted. It modeled the cosmos. And for nearly 2,000 years, it sat at the bottom of the sea, and nobody knew it existed. Tonight, I want to take you to that sea floor. I want to walk you through the wreck, through the museum, through the mechanism itself, gear by gear, dial by dial. I want to tell you the story of the people who made it, the people who found it, and the people who spent their lives trying to understand what it was. And I want to sit with you in the particular kind of wonder that comes from holding something ancient in your mind, something that insists, quietly and completely, that the people who came before us were not simpler than we are. Let's begin. It began, as so many extraordinary things begin, with people doing ordinary work in an extraordinary place. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers from the island of Symi were returning home from the coast of North Africa, where they had been diving for sponges in the shallow coastal waters. They were driven off course by a storm, or perhaps they chose to shelter, accounts vary, and they found themselves near the small island of Antikythera, which sits in the channel between the Greek mainland and Crete, in the southern Aegean. Antikythera is a small place, rocky, windswept, with a handful of inhabitants. But the channel around it has always been one of the busiest sea lanes in the ancient Mediterranean, a crossing point on the route between the eastern Mediterranean and the Italian peninsula. Ships had been passing through these waters for thousands of years. And sometimes, ships had sunk here. One of the divers, his name was Elias Stadiatis, went into the water to look for sponges and came up reporting something strange. At a depth of about 45 meters, lying on a rocky shelf of the sea floor, there was a shipwreck. And around the wreck, scattered across the bottom, there were statues. Bronze statues. Marble statues. The kind of statues that belonged in temples or in the houses of the very wealthy, not at the bottom of the sea. There were arms, torsos, heads, emerging from the sandy bottom like a frozen crowd. The divers came back the following year with official support from the Greek government, and for several months in 1900 and 1901 they worked the wreck, bringing up what they could. The diving was dangerous. At 45 meters, without modern equipment, the divers could only stay down for a few minutes at a time, and at least one man died and several were paralyzed from decompression sickness during the recovery operation. But they brought up an extraordinary haul: bronze and marble statues, glassware, pottery, coins, jewelry, and fragments of various objects whose nature was not immediately clear. Among the fragments brought up in the first season was a lump of corroded bronze, about the size of a thick book, which nobody paid particular attention to at the time. It was logged, wrapped, and placed with the other artifacts recovered from the wreck. It was not until several months later, when the artifacts had been transported to Athens and were being examined by archaeologists, that someone noticed something strange about the lump. It had split open, perhaps from the change in temperature and pressure, perhaps from drying out after its long immersion. And through the crack, you could see something inside. Gears. Small, precisely cut bronze gears, still faintly visible through the corrosion. The archaeologist who first examined the opened fragments was Velleios Staris, a Greek archaeologist who was curator at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Staris recognized immediately that what he was looking at was mechanical, that the gears inside the fragment were not decorative but functional, that they were part of some kind of device. He published a paper in 1902 suggesting that the mechanism was some kind of astronomical instrument, an astrolabe or a similar device used for navigation or for tracking celestial objects. The suggestion was met with considerable skepticism. The year was 1902. The general assumption about the ancient world, an assumption so deep it was barely articulated, was that the ancient Greeks, for all their philosophical and artistic brilliance, had not been capable of mechanical technology of this kind. The gears were too sophisticated. The workmanship was too precise. It simply did not fit the mental picture that educated people in 1902 had of what ancient civilization looked like. The most common response from scholars was that the mechanism must be from a later period, that it had somehow ended up on an ancient wreck by accident, or that the dating of the wreck was wrong. Some simply dismissed Staris's observations. The fragments were placed in a case in the museum, labeled as an astronomical device, and largely ignored for the next 50 years. This is one of the stranger chapters in the history of the Antikythera Mechanism, the half-century during which it sat in a museum, correctly identified as something extraordinary, and was simply not taken seriously. It waited. As it had already waited for 2,000 years at the bottom of the sea, it waited a little longer for someone to pay it the attention it deserved. That someone arrived in the 1950s. His name was Derek de Solla Price, and he was, by training and temperament, exactly the right person to take the Antikythera Mechanism seriously. Price was a British physicist who had become one of the founders of the history of science as an academic discipline. He was interested in the development of scientific instruments through history, in how people had, across centuries and cultures, built physical devices to measure, track, and understand the natural world. He was not the kind of historian who was satisfied with the assumption that ancient people were simpler than modern ones. He believed, as a matter of intellectual principle, that you should never underestimate what human beings in the past were capable of. When Price examined the Antikythera fragments in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he brought to them a combination of historical knowledge, technical understanding, and sheer stubbornness that none of the mechanism's previous examiners had possessed. He had X-ray photographs taken, the first time this had been done, which allowed him to see through the corrosion and the fused surfaces to the gears and dials inside. And what he saw astonished him. The mechanism was not simply a collection of gears. It was a sophisticated calculating device, with multiple interlocking gear trains, multiple dials, and a complexity of design that went far beyond anything previously known from the ancient world. Price spent years studying the X-ray images, building physical models of what the mechanism might have looked like, trying to understand the mathematics behind the gear ratios. In 1974, he published a landmark paper, 62 pages long, exhaustively detailed, titled Gears from the Greeks. In it, he argued that the Antikythera Mechanism was an analog computer for predicting astronomical events, the positions of the sun and moon, the phases of the moon, possibly the positions of the planets. he reconstructed a partial model of how the mechanism had worked. And he made a claim that, even now, retains its power to astonish, that the existence of the Antikythera mechanism forces us to revise our entire understanding of ancient Greek technology. It is, Price wrote, a bit frightening to know that just before the fall of their great civilization the ancient Greeks had come so close to our own scientific technology. Before we go deeper into the mechanism itself, let me spend a little time with the ship it came from. Because the wreck at Antikythera is itself a remarkable thing, and understanding it helps us understand what the mechanism might have been doing there. The ship was large, estimates suggest it was between 40 and 50 meters long, which would make it one of the bigger merchant vessels of its era. Based on the artifacts recovered, it was sailing from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, probably from the island of Rhodes, or from one of the ports of Asia Minor, toward Rome or another destination in the western Mediterranean. The date of the sinking has been estimated, based on the coins and pottery recovered, to somewhere around 60 to 70 BCE, during the late Roman Republic. The cargo was extraordinary. The statues alone, more than 80 pieces have been recovered over the years, and there may be more still on the sea floor, represent a collection of artwork of the highest quality. There were bronze warriors, marble philosophers, glass bowls of Alexandrian manufacture, fine pottery from various Greek cities, and a quantity of luxury goods that suggests the ship was carrying either the property of a very wealthy individual or a consignment of high-value goods destined for an important buyer. Some historians have speculated that the ship may have been carrying loot from the Greek world to Rome. This was a period when wealthy Romans were obsessively collecting Greek art and philosophical objects, and several notable Romans of the period are known to have shipped large quantities of Greek cultural material back to Italy. The philosopher and orator Cicero, for instance, was an avid collector of Greek art during exactly this period. Whether or not the Antikythera ship was specifically connected to any historical figure, it was clearly carrying objects of great value and sophistication. The Antikythera mechanism, on such a ship, was not an anomaly. It was exactly the kind of object that would have been prized by the educated, wealthy, scientifically curious elite of the late Roman Republic, a world in which Greek science and philosophy were the most prestigious intellectual achievements known, and in which owning an instrument that embodied that knowledge was a mark of extraordinary cultivation. I want to pause here and take you to the place itself, to the island of Antikythera and the channel where the ship went down. Antikythera is a small island, barely 10 square kilometers, with a population that even today numbers only a few dozen people in the winter months. It is rugged and windswept, with dramatic cliffs dropping into the sea and a small harbor that offers shelter when the winds are favorable. In the ancient world, it was known as Aegian, a stopping point, a way station, a place where ships could take on water and wait for favorable winds before making the crossing. The channel itself is one of the most treacherous in the Mediterranean. The winds funnel through it unpredictably, and the currents are strong. Sailors in the ancient world feared it. The Roman-era geographer Strabo described the waters around Antikythera as particularly dangerous. And the archaeological record confirms this. There are multiple ancient wrecks in the channel, not just the one that gave up the mechanism. 45 meters is not an extraordinary depth for the Aegean. The sea drops quickly from the coastlines here, but for divers working without modern equipment, it was at the edge of what was survivable. The sponge divers who worked the wreck in 1900 were among the most skilled divers in the world, trained from childhood to work in these depths, and even they paid a terrible price. It is strange to think of the mechanism lying down there, in the dark and the cold, for 2,000 years. Ships passed overhead. Storms churned the surface. Empires rose and fell. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire fell, and the Byzantine Empire rose, and the Ottoman Empire rose, and the modern nation of Greece was born, and all that time, on the bottom of the sea, in the dark, the gears waited. When you have spent time with the Antikythera mechanism, when you have learned what it could do, how it was made, and where it came from, you are left with a question that is, in some ways, the most interesting question of all. If this existed, what else existed? The mechanism is not a fluke. It is too sophisticated, too well-made, too deeply embedded in a tradition of astronomical and mechanical knowledge to be a one-off invention. Someone built it. Someone taught that someone. There was a tradition, a school, a workshop, a lineage of makers that produced this device. And that tradition, as far as we know, left almost no other physical trace. We know from ancient texts that there were other devices like this. Cicero, writing within a generation of when the Antikythera ship sank, describes two devices made by the astronomer Archimedes that could replicate the movements of the sun and the moon and the planets. Other ancient authors describe similar instruments. There were orreries, mechanical models of the solar system, in the ancient world. The knowledge existed. But the knowledge was fragile. It lived in objects, in workshops, in the minds of craftspeople whose names we do not know. When the workshops closed, when the craftspeople died without passing on their knowledge, when the objects were melted down or lost or sank to the bottom of the sea, the knowledge went with them. The Antikythera mechanism survived because it was on a ship that sank in the right place, at the right depth, in the right conditions, to be preserved by the sea for 2,000 years. Every other device of comparable sophistication, and there must have been others, is gone. What we have is this one survivor. This one messenger from a world of mechanical knowledge that we will never fully recover. The mechanism sits in its case in Athens. Dark and incomplete, fragments reassembled into something that almost, but not quite, resembles what it once was. Around it, in the same room, the statues from the wreck stand all lie in their recovered dignity. A bronze youth, his eyes inlaid with glass, still seems to look out at something far away. A marble philosopher holds his silence. They came up from the same darkness. They waited together for 2,000 years, and now they are here, in the light, surrounded by people who cannot quite believe what they are. In part 2, we'll go inside the mechanism itself. We'll follow the gears, count the teeth, understand what it was calculating and why. Rest for a moment. Let the sea floor settle in your mind. Somewhere in Athens, the gears are still. They were moving once. They will move again, in the reconstructions, in the models, in the understanding that keeps growing year by year. But in the museum, they are still. Still, and waiting. Part 2, the object itself. Let me describe it to you. Not as it is now, fragmented, corroded, spread across multiple pieces of ancient bronze, but as it was. As best we can reconstruct it from 2,000 years of damage and a century of analysis. It was a wooden box, roughly the size of a showbox, perhaps a little larger. The wood is long gone, but the bronze fittings that held it together give us its dimensions, approximately 33 centimeters high, 17 centimeters wide, and 9 centimeters deep. On its front face, there were 2 large dials. On its back face, there were 2 more. The dials were marked with carefully inscribed scales, months, years, degrees of the zodiac, the names of astronomical events. And inside the box, packed into that modest volume with extraordinary ingenuity, there were at least 30 gears. 30 gears. Some of them smaller than a modern coin. Each one individually cut, each tooth shaped by hand to a precision that, even today, commands the respect of mechanical engineers. This was not a decoration. It was not a model or a symbol. It was a working machine. You turned a handle on the side, probably, though the handle itself has not survived, and the dials moved. The pointers advanced. The mechanism calculated. The front face of the mechanism was dominated by a large circular dial, the main dial, the one that everything else revolved around. It was divided into two concentric rings. The outer ring represented the Egyptian calendar, a calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each plus 5 extra days at the end of the year. This was the administrative calendar of the ancient Mediterranean world, standardized and predictable, useful for calculating dates. The inner ring represented the Greek zodiac, the band of constellations through which the sun appears to move over the course of a year, divided into 12 sections of 30 degrees each. The zodiac ring could be adjusted to account for the fact that the Egyptian calendar and the actual solar year don't quite align. The mechanism included a correction mechanism, a small extra gear, that allowed the user to compensate for the leap year that the Egyptian calendar didn't include. On this front dial, two pointers moved together. One tracked the position of the sun in the zodiac over the course of the year. The other tracked the position of the moon, and this was the first place where the mechanism's genius became fully apparent. The moon does not orbit the Earth in a perfect circle. Its orbit is elliptical, which means it moves faster when it is closer to the Earth and slower when it is farther away. Ancient astronomers knew this. They had observed it carefully over centuries of watching the sky, but calculating the moon's varying speed was mathematically complex. The Antikythera mechanism handled this problem with an elegant mechanical solution, a small pin on one gear that fitted into a slot on another gear, creating a variable speed drive that exactly replicated the moon's changing pace as it moved through its orbit. This pin and slot mechanism is, from an engineering perspective, one of the most remarkable features of the entire device. It is a solution to a complex mathematical problem achieved through pure mechanical ingenuity, the translation of an astronomical observation into a physical movement, made by hands that understood both the sky and the metal. If the front of the mechanism was the face it showed to the world, the visible display of the sun and moon, the back was where its deeper calculations lived. The upper back dial tracked the metonic cycle. The metonic cycle is a period of 19 years, specifically 235 lunar months, at the end of which the phases of the moon repeat on the same days of the solar calendar. It was discovered by the Athenian astronomer Meton in the 5th century BCE, and it was one of the fundamental tools of ancient calendar keeping. If you knew the phase of the moon on a given date, and you knew the metonic cycle, you could calculate the phase of the moon on any date in the future. The metonic dial on the back of the mechanism was a spiral dial. A pointer moved along a spiral track divided into 235 segments, one for each month of the 19-year cycle. It was, in effect, a perpetual calendar, capable of tracking the relationship between the solar year and the lunar month indefinitely into the future. Below the metonic dial was a smaller dial that tracked the calippic cycle, a period of 76 years, or 4 metonic cycles, after which the calendar realigned even more precisely. The inclusion of this dial suggests that the mechanism's makers were thinking not just about immediate calculations but about long-term astronomical precision. The lower back dial tracked the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years and 11 days, after which solar and lunar eclipses repeat in the same pattern. The Saros cycle was the key to eclipse prediction. If you knew when an eclipse had occurred, and you added one Saros cycle, you could predict when the next eclipse in that series would occur. The dial was arranged as a spiral of 223 months, and at each month where an eclipse was predicted, a small inscription indicated what kind of eclipse it would be, solar or lunar, and how significant. Beside the Saros dial was an exoligmos dial, tracking a period of 3 Saros cycles, 54 years, after which eclipse cycles realigned even more precisely. Together, these two dials gave the mechanism's user the ability to predict eclipses with a reliability that had previously required generations of careful observation and complex calculation. For decades after Price's initial analysis, the conventional understanding of the Antikythera mechanism held that it tracked the Sun and the Moon but not the planets. The planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, were known to the ancient Greeks, and their movements had been carefully observed and catalogued. But the mechanism seemed, on early analysis, not to include them. This understanding began to change in the early years of the 21st century, when a team of researchers applied new imaging technology to the surviving fragments, including a technique called polynomial texture mapping, which allows researchers to see surface features invisible to normal light, and discovered inscriptions and mechanical features that had previously been invisible. What they found was transformative. Hidden in the fragmentary remains of the mechanism were traces of gears and inscriptions that, when analyzed, suggested that the mechanism had originally included representations of all 5 planets known to the ancient world. Each planet had its own dial, its own gear train, its own pointer moving across its own scale. This discovery, confirmed to varying degrees by different researchers, still being fully worked out, elevated the Antikythera mechanism from a remarkable astronomical instrument to something even more extraordinary, a complete mechanical model of the known cosmos. Not just the Sun and Moon, but all the wandering stars, moving across their dials in their proper cycles, driven by gears that encoded the mathematics of their orbits. If this reconstruction is correct, and the evidence for it is substantial, then the Antikythera mechanism was, in the most literal sense, a model of the universe. A small, portable, hand-cranked universe, accurate enough to predict the sky for any date in the past or future, designed to fit in a box that you could carry on a ship. One of the most valuable things the imaging technology revealed was the extent and content of the inscriptions on the mechanism. The ancient makers had covered the device, its dials, its plates, its visible surfaces, with text. Instructions. Labels. Descriptions of what the dials showed and how to read them. These inscriptions were, for most of the mechanism's modern existence, partially illegible, obscured by corrosion, damaged by time, or simply too small and faint to read with available technology. But as imaging improved, more and more of the text became readable, and what it revealed was remarkable. The inscriptions are written in ancient Greek, a form of Koine Greek, the common dialect of the Hellenistic world. They describe the dials, identify the astronomical cycles being tracked, and in places provide what appear to be operating instructions for the device. One section of inscription, recovered from the back cover of the mechanism, appears to be a guide to reading the planetary displays, a user manual, written 2,000 years ago, for a machine that had no successor for a millennium. Among the inscriptions, researchers have found references to specific astronomical events, the rising and setting of particular stars, the timing of particular planetary phenomena, that help to anchor the mechanism's calendar to a specific period and location. The inscriptions refer to events visible from the eastern Mediterranean, probably from somewhere in the latitude of Rhodes or Alexandria, in the late 2nd or early 1st century BCE. They give us, in other words, a picture of the sky that the mechanism's makers were looking at, and the cosmos they were trying to model. I want to spend a moment on the physical making of the mechanism, on what it meant, in practical terms, to build this device by hand in the 1st century BCE. The gears of the Antikythera mechanism were cut from sheet bronze, bronze that was first cast in large sheets, then worked to a consistent thickness, then cut into gear blanks, then had their teeth cut one by one. The cutting of the teeth was done with a tool, probably a small chisel or a specialized cutter, that had to be precisely positioned for each tooth, on each gear, to achieve the accuracy necessary for the mechanism to work correctly. The smallest gears in the mechanism have teeth less than a millimeter across. The largest have teeth several millimeters wide. All of them had to be cut to consistent dimensions, because the accuracy of the mechanism's calculations depended on the accuracy of the gear ratios, and the gear ratios were only accurate if the number of teeth on each gear was exactly what the designer had specified. This is not easy work. It requires a combination of mathematical understanding to design the gear trains in the first place, and manual precision to execute the design in metal that speaks to a level of craftsmanship that we have largely forgotten existed in the ancient world. The people who built the Antikythera mechanism were not primitive artisans working by feel. They were skilled engineers with a sophisticated understanding of both mathematics and materials. Modern replicas of the mechanism, and there have been several, built by researchers and by watchmakers and by clockmakers who wanted to understand how it was done, have found that reproducing the mechanism with ancient tools is difficult but not impossible. With the right skills and the right tools, you can make something that works. The knowledge was real. The capability was real. What is lost is not the possibility but the continuity, the unbroken chain of instruction and practice that would have passed this knowledge from one generation to the next. Let me try to imagine what it felt like to use the Antikythera mechanism. You are in the ancient world. Perhaps you are a scholar, perhaps a ship's navigator, perhaps a wealthy Roman who has acquired this device from a Greek philosopher or craftsman. You have the box in front of you, its bronze face is gleaming, its dials marked with the symbols of the zodiac and the names of the months. You want to know, on this date, in this year, where is the moon? You turn the handle. The gears inside the box begin to move, a faint, complex sound of bronze against bronze, the teeth of the gears engaging and driving each other in their calculated ratios. The pointer on the front dial moves, slowly, around the zodiac ring. You watch it settle, and you read the position. You want to know, will there be an eclipse this year? You look at the back of the box. The Saros dial, with its spiral of months, shows you where you are in the cycle. You look at the inscriptions near the pointer's position. There is a small marking there, a symbol that means a lunar eclipse is predicted, in such and such a month, of such and such a magnitude. You set the box down. The cosmos is in your hands. The mathematics of the sky, the accumulated observations of centuries of astronomers, the calculations of the best mathematical minds of the ancient world, have been distilled into this box, these gears, these pointers moving across these dials. It is not mystical. It is not magical. It is the opposite of magic, it is understanding, made physical. It is the ancient world saying, we have watched the sky long enough to know its patterns, and we have been clever enough to build a machine that remembers them for us. The mechanism sits in its fragments in Athens. 30 gears, and there were once more, in the parts that have been lost, each one cut by a hand that is dust now. Each tooth shaped by a mind that understood the sky. In part 3, we go looking for that mind. We ask, who built this? In what world, in what workshop, for what purpose? The answer takes us to one of the most remarkable moments in the history of human knowledge, a moment when, briefly, the ancient world came very close to something we would recognize as modern science. Rest here. Let the gears be still. Somewhere in Athens, in its glass case, the mechanism waits. It has been patient for a very long time. Part 3, the the world it came from. To understand the Antikythera mechanism, you need to understand the world that produced it. Not just ancient Greece in the abstract, not the Athens of the Parthenon and Socrates and the great tragedies, which is the ancient Greece most people carry in their heads, but a more specific, less familiar world. The world of the Hellenistic period, the 3 centuries between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE and the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE, when Greek language and Greek thought spread across an enormous swath of the known world, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the borders of India, and when Greek science reached heights that would not be matched again for more than a millennium. This was the world of Euclid and Archimedes and Eratosthenes. The world of the Library of Alexandria, where the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world was gathered in one place and systematically organized. The world of Hipparchus, who catalogued the stars and discovered the precession of the equinoxes. The world of Aristarchus of Samos, who argued, 2,000 years before Copernicus, that the Earth moved around the Sun. It was, by any measure, one of the great intellectual flourishings in human history. And the Antikythera mechanism is its most tangible surviving artifact. Alexander the Great died young, he was 32, but in 13 years of conquest he had spread Greek culture and the Greek language across a territory stretching from Greece itself through Persia and Egypt to the borders of India. When his empire fragmented after his death, divided among his generals, the pieces retained their Greek character. Greek became the lingua franca of the educated world, the language of scholarship, philosophy, commerce, and science across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. This created something unprecedented, a world in which scholars in Alexandria could read the work of scholars in Babylon, in which astronomers in Rhodes could correspond with astronomers in Athens, in which mathematical ideas developed in one city could be known and built upon in another. The knowledge was mobile. It could accumulate across generations and across geography in ways that had never been possible before. The center of this world, intellectually speaking, was Alexandria. The city founded by Alexander at the mouth of the Nile became, under the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the greatest center of scholarship the ancient world had ever seen. The Library of Alexandria, at its height, perhaps the largest collection of written knowledge ever assembled in the ancient world, attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. The Mauseon, the research institution attached to the library, provided them with salaries, housing, and a community of peers. It was, in some ways, recognizable as a research university, the first in history. But Alexandria was not the only center. Rhodes, the island in the eastern Aegean, was another. Rhodes was prosperous, politically stable, and intellectually ambitious. It had a tradition of scholarship that was particularly strong in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Several of the most important scientists and scholars of the Hellenistic world were associated with Rhodes, including Hipparchus, who is widely regarded as the greatest astronomer of antiquity, and who may have a direct connection to the Antikythera mechanism. Hipparchus of Nicaea lived and worked in the 2nd century BCE, conducting most of his astronomical observations from Rhodes. He was, by any measure, one of the greatest scientists of the ancient world. His contributions to astronomy were transformative. He compiled the first known comprehensive star catalogue, listing the positions of approximately 850 stars, accurate enough to be useful for navigation and for tracking changes in the sky over time. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the equinoxes to shift gradually against the background of stars over a period of approximately 26,000 years. He developed the mathematics of the spherical trigonometry that was necessary for precise astronomical calculation. And he worked extensively on the theory of the moon's motion, including the variable speed orbit that the Antikythera mechanism's pin and slot mechanism replicates. The connection between Hipparchus and the Antikythera mechanism is not proven. We have no document that says Hipparchus designed this or this mechanism was built from Hipparchus's calculations. But the mathematics embedded in the mechanism's gears is consistent with the astronomical theory of Hipparchus's era and school. The gear ratios that drive the moon pointer encode the same understanding of the moon's variable orbit that Hipparchus developed. The eclipse prediction capabilities of the mechanism reflect the same astronomical observations that Hipparchus made. It is possible, even likely, some researchers argue, that the Antikythera mechanism was built in Rhodes, in the tradition of Hipparchus, by craftsmen who had access to the best astronomical knowledge of the Hellenistic world. It is possible that Hipparchus himself, or someone in his immediate circle, contributed to its design. What is certain is that the mechanism could not have been built without the mathematical astronomy that Hipparchus represented, without centuries of careful sky watching, precise measurement, and mathematical analysis that produced the numbers encoded in the gears. The Antikythera mechanism did not appear from nowhere. It was the product of a tradition, a long history of building mechanical devices in the ancient world that is mostly invisible to us now, because almost none of those devices have survived. We know the tradition existed from texts. Archimedes, the greatest mathematician and engineer of the ancient world, who lived in Syracuse in the 3rd century BCE, is described by ancient authors as having built mechanical models of the cosmos. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes seeing two such devices, one built by Archimedes himself, one built by a later craftsman in the same tradition. Both, Cicero says, could replicate the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets in their proper cycles. There are other references, scattered through ancient literature, to mechanical devices of various kinds, automata, water clocks, devices that played music, devices that moved figures in theatrical performances. Hero of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century CE, wrote extensively about mechanical devices, including detailed instructions for building automata and other machines. The tradition of Greek mechanics was rich and sophisticated. But almost none of it has survived in physical form. Bronze, the primary material for precision mechanical work in the ancient world, was valuable. It could be melted down and reused, and it was. Wood rotted. Only the devices that ended up in unusually preserving conditions, at the bottom of the sea, for instance, had any chance of survival over 2,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism is, in this sense, the visible tip of an invisible iceberg. Below it lies a tradition of mechanical knowledge that we can only dimly perceive, in the scattered references in ancient texts, in the single surviving physical artifact, in the implications of what the mechanism itself represents. The question of who specifically made the Antikythera mechanism, which craftsman's hands cut which gear, which mathematician's mind designed which gear train, is one we cannot answer with certainty. But we can say some things. The maker was literate and mathematically sophisticated. The inscriptions on the mechanism demonstrate a command of astronomical theory that was, even in the ancient world, the preserve of a small scholarly elite. The maker knew the Metonic cycle, the Saros cycle, the Callippic cycle, the fundamental periods of ancient astronomical calculation. They knew the theory of the moon's variable speed orbit. They may have known the theory of the planet's motions. The maker was also a skilled craftsman. The precision of the gears, the elegance of the pin and slot mechanism, the ingenuity of the overall design, these speak to someone who worked in metal regularly, who understood the properties of bronze and the techniques of gear cutting, who could translate mathematical specifications into physical reality with extraordinary skill. In the ancient world, the separation between the theoretical and the practical, between the mathematician and the craftsman, was not as sharp as it might seem. Archimedes, the greatest mathematician of antiquity, was also a builder of siege engines and mechanical devices. The tradition of Greek mechanics assumed that mathematical theory and physical construction were aspects of the same knowledge. The Antikythera Mechanism's maker may have been someone very much in this tradition, a scholar craftsman, at home with both the mathematics of the cosmos and the mechanics of bronze, working in a workshop that served the intellectual needs of the Hellenistic elite. The Hellenistic world, the world that produced the Antikythera Mechanism, came to an end, gradually, over the 1st century BCE and the first few centuries CE. The Roman conquest brought political stability but also, eventually, a shift in intellectual priorities. The Great Library at Alexandria suffered losses and decline. The tradition of mathematical astronomy continued in the work of Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE, but the tradition of precision mechanical construction seems to have faded. Why? This is a question that historians of ancient technology have debated at length. Part of the answer may be economic. The kind of precision mechanical work that the Antikythera Mechanism represents required skilled craftsmen who were expensive to train and maintain, and in a world where human labor was cheap, there was less incentive to develop labor-saving machines. Part of the answer may be cultural. The educated elite of the Roman world valued Greek philosophy but did not particularly value Greek technical knowledge in the way the Hellenistic scholars had. Part of it may simply be fragility, knowledge that lives in objects and workshops, and the minds of craftspeople is vulnerable in ways that knowledge in texts is not. Whatever the reasons, the tradition that produced the Antikythera Mechanism disappeared. The knowledge of how to build such devices was lost. The gears stopped being made. And the single survivor of the tradition sank to the bottom of the sea, where it waited for 2,000 years for someone to find it and understand what it was. I want to sit for a moment with the larger implications of what the Antikythera Mechanism represents. We tend, I think, to imagine the past as a story of progress, a linear movement from less to more knowledge, from simpler to more complex capability, from primitive to advanced. The ancient world, in this mental picture, was an earlier, simpler stage on the way to where we are now. The Antikythera Mechanism refuses this picture. It insists that the ancient world was not a simpler place, that the minds of 2,000 years ago were as capable as ours, that the knowledge they accumulated was real and sophisticated and profound. And it insists that progress is not guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that capability can disappear, that the story of human understanding is not a smooth upward curve but a jagged line with ascents and descents. The people who built this mechanism understood things about the sky that would not be understood again for 1,000 years. They built a machine that encoded that understanding with a precision and elegance that commands respect today. And then the knowledge was lost, not because people became less intelligent, not because the world became less interested in understanding the sky, but because the fragile chains of transmission that connected teacher to student, workshop to workshop, generation to generation, were broken. This is, in some ways, a sad story. But it is also a remarkable one. The mechanism survived. We found it. And the finding of it has changed how we think about what human beings are capable of, about the range of what is possible, about the dangers of underestimating the past, about the value of the single surviving artifact that tells us what was possible in a world we thought we understood. The world that made this mechanism is gone. The workshops are gone, the craftsmen are gone, the mathematical tradition they served is partly gone. Rhodes is still an island in the Aegean, its harbour still busy, but the scholars who once worked there are dust, and the devices they made, all but one, are dust with them. What remains is the mechanism. The one survivor. the one physical proof that a world existed which we had not fully imagined. In Part 4, we follow the people who have spent the modern era trying to fully understand it. The engineers, the physicists, the historians who have devoted years of their lives to the fragments in the case in Athens. And we sit with what they have found, and what the finding means for how we think about knowledge, about loss, and about the people who came before us. Rest here. We have traveled far tonight. Part 4, What It Changed. We have arrived, as we always do, at the place where the story opens outward. The Antikythera Mechanism is a specific object, a specific collection of bronze fragments, in a specific museum, recovered from a specific wreck in a specific channel of the Aegean Sea. But its implications reach far beyond its specificity. It is a lever that, when you push on it, moves many things at once: our understanding of ancient technology, of the nature of scientific knowledge, of what it means for something to be lost and found. In this final part, I want to follow those implications. I want to tell you about the modern researchers who have spent decades of their lives with the mechanism, and what they have found. I want to talk about what the mechanism has changed in our understanding of the ancient world and in our understanding of ourselves. And I want to sit, finally, with the question that the mechanism most insistently raises: what does it mean that this existed, and that we nearly missed it? In 2005, a consortium of researchers, Greek and British and American, from universities and museums and technology companies, came together to form the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project. Their goal was to apply the most advanced imaging and analysis technology available to the surviving fragments of the mechanism, and to produce the most complete and accurate understanding of it ever achieved. The tools they brought to bear were extraordinary. X-ray computed tomography, CT scanning, allowed them to produce three-dimensional images of the internal structure of the fragments, revealing gear trains and inscriptions that had been invisible inside the corroded bronze. Polynomial texture mapping allowed them to recover faint surface features that normal lighting would never show. Multispectral imaging revealed text that was invisible to the naked eye. What they found, and what they published in a series of papers over the following years, transformed the understanding of the mechanism. They confirmed and extended Price's earlier work. They recovered large quantities of previously illegible inscription. They identified the planetary mechanism that earlier researchers had not seen. They produced the most detailed reconstruction of the mechanism's operation ever achieved. The project is ongoing. New fragments are still being found. New imaging techniques are still being applied. As recently as 2016, a new analysis of previously ignored fragments revealed additional text that changed the reconstruction of part of the mechanism. The mechanism is, in a very real sense, still being discovered, still giving up its secrets, decades after it was first pulled from the sea. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Antikythera Mechanism's modern history is the number of people who have been moved to build working replicas of it. The first serious attempt at a physical reconstruction was made by Price himself in the 1970s, when he commissioned a model from a craftsman in London. Price's reconstruction was partial; it represented his best understanding at the time, which has since been significantly revised, but it was the first physical proof that the mechanism, as he had described it, could actually work. The gears meshed. The pointers moved. The mathematics was real. Since then, there have been numerous reconstructions. A Greek team built a working model in the 1990s. Michael Wright, a curator at the Science Museum in London, spent more than a decade building a reconstruction that incorporated his own analysis of the fragments and represents what he believed to be the most complete version. A team at University College London, working with the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project data, built a computer model and then a physical model that includes the planetary mechanism suggested by the latest analysis. Each reconstruction is, in a sense, a hypothesis, a physical argument about how the mechanism worked, made concrete. When a reconstruction works, when the gears mesh and the pointers move correctly and the calculations come out right, it is a kind of proof. Not proof that the reconstruction is exactly right, but proof that the underlying idea is sound, that the ancient makers' intentions were achievable, that the thing they designed could be built and could work. There is something moving about these modern reconstructors, these engineers and historians and craftsmen who have spent years of their lives trying to understand and replicate the work of ancient makers whose names we don't know. There is a conversation happening across 2,000 years, conducted in the language of gears and bronze and mathematics. In 2022, a team of researchers returned to the Antikythera wreck with the most advanced underwater archaeological equipment ever used at the site, including a specially designed exosuit that allowed a diver to work at the site's depth for extended periods, and a range of underwater scanning and imaging tools. They found more. They always find more at Antikythera. The site has never been fully excavated, and decades of sedimentation have buried much of the wreck's cargo under the sea floor. In 2022, the team recovered additional fragments of bronze, some of which have been tentatively identified as possibly belonging to the mechanism, though this identification is still being studied, as well as other artifacts from the wreck. The possibility that additional fragments of the mechanism might still be on the sea floor is one of the most tantalizing prospects in the archaeology of ancient technology. The surviving fragments account for, at most, about a third of the mechanism's original volume. The rest, 2/3 of the device, including parts that would answer some of the most important remaining questions about its design, may be still there, buried under the sediment of the sea floor, waiting. The Antikythera wreck has been known for more than a century. It has been intermittently excavated for almost that long. And it is still giving up its secrets. The sea is patient. The sea has always been patient with this particular treasure. The Antikythera mechanism has changed the way historians and archaeologists think about the ancient world in ways that go beyond the mechanism itself. Before its discovery and analysis, the dominant picture of ancient Greek technology was largely literary, based on what ancient authors said about machines, rather than on surviving physical evidence. And ancient authors, being mostly concerned with philosophy, history, and literature, did not write extensively about mechanical technology. The picture was therefore incomplete, and the incompleteness was filled in with assumptions that tended to underestimate what the ancient world was capable of. The mechanism challenged those assumptions directly. Here was a physical object that demonstrated, beyond any possibility of doubt, that ancient Greek craftsmen had built precision mechanical devices of extraordinary sophistication. The assumptions had to be revised. And once they were revised, scholars began to look at the ancient world differently, to read the scattered references to mechanical devices in ancient texts with new attention, to ask what other capabilities might have existed that the texts didn't happen to record. This is one of the mechanism's most important gifts. It has made historians more humble about what they don't know. It is a reminder that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that the ancient world contained capabilities and achievements that simply didn't survive to be recorded, and that our picture of the past is always partial, always incomplete, always subject to revision by the next unexpected find. I want to say something about the emotional dimension of the Antikythera mechanism, about what it feels like to encounter it, not just as a historical artifact or a technical marvel, but as a human object. The mechanism was made by people. Specific people, with names and families and daily lives that we will never know. Someone designed it, probably someone with a deep, lifelong love of the sky, who had spent years studying the movements of the stars and the planets and who wanted to build something that would capture that knowledge in a physical form. Someone made it, someone with skilled hands and an intimate knowledge of bronze and tools, who cut each gear tooth by hand, who fitted the gears together with the care that only someone who understood what they were making could bring to the work. And someone used it. Someone held this box in their hands and turned the handle and watched the pointers move and read the sky's future from the dials. Maybe a scholar verifying a calculation. Maybe a navigator planning a voyage. Maybe a wealthy patron showing off the most sophisticated device of his era to a visitor who had never seen anything like it. All of those people are gone. Their names are gone. Their voices are gone. What remains is the object, the bronze and the gears and the inscriptions, corroded by 2,000 years of seawater, speaking across that time in the only language available to them now, the language of physical presence, of the thing itself, of the gear that someone's hand cut and someone's hand assembled and someone's hand turned. There is a quality to very old human-made objects, to things that have survived long enough to outlast everyone who knew what they were for, that is difficult to articulate and impossible to escape. The mechanism carries this quality in full. It is not just a remarkable machine. It is a message, from minds we cannot reach, that says, we were here. We thought about the sky. We built something to hold our thinking in. In these final moments, I want to ask the question that the Antikythera Mechanism most insistently raises for me, not as a question about the ancient world, but as a question about us, about the present, about what this object from the deep past might mean for how we think about our own civilization. The mechanism was lost. Not through carelessness, not through indifference, but simply through the ordinary fragility of knowledge, the fact that what human beings know lives in specific places and specific people and specific objects, and can be destroyed when those places are sacked, when those people die, when those objects sink to the bottom of the sea. We tend to assume, I think, that our knowledge is safe. We have books, and the internet, and vast systems of redundant storage. We have institutions dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. We have, in short, far more robust systems for transmitting what we know to the future than the ancient world had. And yet, the Antikythera Mechanism is a reminder that even the most sophisticated civilizations can lose the things that matter most. The Hellenistic world had scholars and libraries and institutions. It had a centuries-long tradition of careful observation and mathematical analysis. It had craftsmen who could build precision instruments of extraordinary complexity. And it lost almost all of it, not in a day, not in a single catastrophe, but gradually, over centuries, as the specific conditions that made it possible slowly changed. What we have, what we are, is always more fragile than it seems. The knowledge we take for granted is always the product of chains of transmission that could, under different circumstances, be broken. The capability we assume is permanent is always, in the end, a habit, something that exists because people keep practicing it, keep passing it on, keep finding it worth preserving. The Antikythera Mechanism does not tell us to be afraid. It tells us to pay attention, to value the knowledge we have, and the people who make it and keep it and pass it on. To remember that understanding is not automatic, that it requires effort, and institutions, and the willingness to take the long view, to do work whose fruits may not be harvested for generations. The mechanism sits in its case in Athens. Fragment A, the largest piece, with its corroded faces and its faint inscriptions. Fragment B, smaller, with traces of gear teeth still visible. The other fragments, carefully labeled, carefully preserved, in their carefully controlled environment. Around it, the statues from the wreck. The bronze youth with his glass eyes. the marble figures in their recovered calm. All of them risen from the same darkness, all of them carrying the same freight of time. Someone made all of these things. Someone shaped the bronze and cut the marble and fitted the gears with patient, knowing hands. Someone put them on a ship, in the spring or the autumn of a year we can only roughly name, sailing toward a destination they never reached. The ship went down. The things it carried went with it, slowly, gently, settling into the silence of the sea floor, covered by sand and time. And the sea kept them. For 2,000 years, the sea kept them. While above, on the surface, the world changed beyond recognition, empires rising and falling, languages dying and being born, the very names of the gods changing, below, in the cold and the dark, the gears were still. We found them. We pulled them up, out of the dark, into the light. We turned them over in our hands, and we asked, "What is this? Who made this? What were they trying to say?" And the mechanism answered us, in the only language it has, the language of gear teeth and bronze and the mathematics of the sky. A language that took us a century to learn to hear, but that, once heard, says something clear and plain and extraordinary. We understood the cosmos. We built a machine to hold that understanding. We put the machine on a ship. The ship sank. And the machine waited, in the dark, for someone who could listen. You are listening now. That is what matters. That is everything. The gears are still. Good night.